I keep getting cut off on my videos, so because I keep running out of space. So I deleted a bunch, cleared up a bunch of space, and I'm sort of taking some time off right now because I broke a rib and pulled a muscle. Did it actually break? Or is it just bruised? I think it broke. I don't know. It's painful. Quite painful. It seems to take a long time to heal. But anyways, I want to talk about sexuality. Just uploaded a video on it, and I'm not sure it's the one I want. So I'm trying again. But I feel I've become more innocent over time, which is kind of a wild thing to say. And I could also say more modest over time in many ways. And that is a testament to doing a lot of healing. It's maybe also a testament just to getting older. And I feel, comparatively a prude, comparatively compared to the sort of prevailing social contemporary social values, social milieu. It's sort of funny when you're given, we're in this very hedonistic society, and we're in kind of a garden of external delights where we have so much access to so many routes of gratification, of our, satiation of our pleasure drive. Uniquely in this moment in history, in this moment in time, I'm speaking from inside the US, but in many places in the world, in part because of the internet, in large part, and just technology in general. That you have the opportunity to be a sort of pure, almost a platonic ideal of a hedonist in some ways. That we sort of only vaguely and partially were able to manifest in previous generations. We're sort of it's hard to say this is the apex in some ways, just because you don't know where we're headed. And the trajectory just seems that we become more and more distracted, more and more addicted, more and more. It's like all the dials on our kind of all of our pleasure seeking dials, and it's all sort of been optimized, you know, the potency of gratification across so many domains, across, food, you know, being packed with whatever maximal amounts of sugar, of salt, of whatever chemical ingredients, you know, optimized in terms of the potency of substances, drugs, you know, sort of that idea of the fentanylization of, I almost want to say, of reality, because it's just so all pervasive that we've figured out, and it's not like it's super complicated or sophisticated, but we just know how to exploit human vulnerability, human weakness, human condition, human woundedness, and our addictability. It's like we've figured out how to do that, and we just continue to optimize and extract, whether it's attention or we've just become very efficient at exploiting our humanity in that sense. The economy is sort of predicated in some ways, maybe that's too strong, but upon our addictability and finding more and more efficient ways to get us, to get our attention, to get our money, get our spirit, you could say, our soul, our spirit, our energy. It's like we've created all these efficient routes of extraction of human spirit. And that's, that's pretty bleak, that's pretty dystopian, but you can kind of just map it out in your own life, in the world around you, and you can see that there's some truth in that vision. And so it's not like a unique moment in time, in the sense that it's sort of just been it's a logic, where we're at is kind of a logical outcome of where we've been headed for many years. And again, it's sort of just part and parcel of the operating system here in this reality. What's indicated or implicated, pointed to with a term like samsara or dukkha or original sin, the fall, brokenness, is that we have this outward facing, externalizing, what am I trying to say here? That we're looking for gratification. Part of our humanity, part of our condition here is we're pain avoidant, we're pleasure seeking, and that means that we're kind of looking externally for satisfaction and finding just a cornucopia of delights here in this modern moment. And that's the loss of innocence, because healing, wholeness is not an external path. It's the turning of that arrow inwards. But there's so much momentum behind this external drive to gratify our senses, gratify our hedonic needs. There's immense energy and momentum behind that movement, and so many reinforcing feedback loops, and economically, culturally, even biologically, that we get kind of debauched, to use one word, defiled, that we lose our innocence in these pursuits, ultimately because God is satisfaction. The soul needs a landing place, but when we've lost that connection, or lost even the recognition that that connection is possible, to be one, to move in a less divided direction, a direction towards God, a direction towards spirit. Without that possibility, without that connection, without that living reality, that your identity, your root is in God, is in the unmanifest potency, the unmanifest dimension of creation. We start to look for substitutes, for surrogates, and we start to identify at all these lower altitudes, and we lose that innocence, that purity, that grace, that light, that blinding radiance. We start to see through a glass darkly. And the nature of addiction is that it's slowly or quickly, in this day and age, again, because we've kind of optimized all those dials of gratification, it tends to move a little bit quicker. But the nature of kind of a lower identification, you could say, ultimately is ruination, is death, is dissipation, enslavement. But that addiction moves you ever further away. Just kind of in practical terms, you need more to get high, you need more frequency, you need more potency, you need more substance. It's like you're always chasing the high. It's never as good as the original high. You're chasing a rainbow, essentially, something you're never going to arrive at. That takes you further and further away from yourself, from who you are, from God, from peace, from wholeness. And it's sort of always been that way, but we're just living in kind of the limit case of those possibilities here in the present moment, And there is a jujitsu that you can do, or there is kind of a silver lining. You don't want to say what I'm about to say too glibly, because there's real world consequences of all the ways we can get lost in substances and in addictive patterns, and whether it's food, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's sexual addictions, whether it's internet addiction, whether it's relationship addiction, whatever the pattern is, however it manifests concretely, um, that obviously there's enormous consequences, collateral damage, internal damage, external damage, up to the most consequential, possibilities of death, of abuse, of financial devastation, whatever. So these are not, obviously not trivial things. However, we sort of uniquely have the possibility to become disillusioned. I've said this in other videos. It's like we're able to bottom out. We're able to become deeply disillusioned. We're able to become devastated and in need of surrender, in need of God. Perhaps quicker. We're able to get to that bottom quicker in this generation than in previous generations, where the addiction might have taken hold more slowly, been more insidious, taken more time to max out. Now it's just like we can, and so many of the cultural guardrails, I can't remember if I said this in this video or not, so many of the cultural guardrails socially, the traditional values and norms that kind of had an embedded protection, an embedded safety, an embedded wisdom, an embedded code for social coherence and for, restraint, moderation, temperance around, our addictive tendencies. So much of that has just been disassembled, broken apart, hollowed out. So we don't have that kind of backstop culturally, traditionally, morally, however you want to look at it, religiously. We don't have that backstop. And so these passions within us just run wild, and they can get to a point of saturation much quicker, which again, I don't say that lightly because of just all the pain that implies, that it can imply. I mean, there's also, I don't know how much I believe this, but there's also a possibility in this generation that we're able to vicariously kind of run through all that. Meaning, we're able to see the devastation and impact in other people's lives who have gone down the road of addiction. And we can kind of vicariously go through all of that, not having to actually suffer the consequences, but just seeing it in other people. And for some of us, maybe that's enough, is just seeing it, and that, gives us a kind of inoculation or wisdom about the emptiness, the vanity of external gratification. I don't know how strongly I want to say that. For many of us, for most of us, we have to at least kind of somewhat, if not totally, get lost in our confusion and our desires to figure out, what was, to figure out kind of firsthand and to understand firsthand that our happiness does not lie in external gratification. Anyways, I want to bring in sexual energy into this context, not because it's like a unique or wholly different category of addiction, though in some ways perhaps it is, but it kind of shares the fundamental underlying dynamics of any other addiction. So which I've already talked about, many times, and here in this video as well. But as you heal, there's a kind of, see, all these addictions, they play a certain role. I mean, everything belongs, to say it one way. Not that everything is right or conduces to the good, but there's that idea that for some of us, maybe all of us, addiction is a kind of self-medication. And so you don't want to say you honor the drugs, because ultimately it's a siren's call. It's a short-term relief that is actually just amplifying and entrenching the dysfunction. So it's a mirage in that sense. It's not real medicine. But when we're in pain, when we have anxiety, and when we have easy routes to get short-term relief and seemingly unlimited supplies of whatever the drug is, or access to, it's just a basic mathematics that a certain percentage of humanity is going to get addicted, But as you heal in an authentic way, as you go in, as you burn in the fire, as you allow the hell inside of you to come forward and to release and to transmute, the addictions, the grasp they have over your life starts to loosen, because you're operating from a more whole state, less divided state, less desperate state, a more healed state. And so the need for other forms of medication, of relief, let's say, diminishes. Ideally, that's kind of the theoretical way to put it. And I found that to be largely true. Although I can say practically, realistically, it's been a combination of, for myself, dealing with my own addictive patterns, combination of grit, strong determination, self-discipline, willingness to suffer, mixed in with, well, I don't know if it's mixed in. Let's say the healing process itself, there's something natural about it, because we know how to heal. It's like a river knows its way to the sea. It's just a matter of following gravity, basically. Following the path of least resistance, following gravity out to the sea. So it's a very natural process, but we're very unnatural creatures at this point in creation. We've drifted. What's that Michael Jackson song? Anyways, we've drifted far from center, far from God. So, but the path is simple in the sense that it's all it is surrender, really, bottom line. And allowing creation to work through you, allowing healing to work through you. That's true. That's really true, but on many levels. But what facilitates that? So it's simple, but I found personally that there is a kind of just dogged grit, determination, discipline, willingness to suffer that you have to have. Yeah, full stop that you have to have. Now, well, I don't know. However, it's you. Yeah. So in one sense, it's that. And where does that come from? Well, that's a good question. I don't exactly know. I've got a sense, previous lives, perhaps. Uh, but I think maybe the simpler answer is desperation, is suffering, the recognition, again, that you kind of come to the end of what you are capable of doing by yourself or inducing through external gratification. You see the emptiness of that, the futility of that, and there's a kind of desperation that can kick in. And so there's, yeah, it's sort of like pain has the potential to, and I think maybe eventually, hopefully for all of us, to reorient us. It's like that same, it's sort of like a sublimation or a purification or a higher octave. I don't know if that's quite right, but let's just say higher octave of the pleasure seeking principle that first enslaves us to our desires because we're avoiding pain. We're momentarily avoiding pain, but eventually that system collapses in on itself because the addictive, it's just self-destructive. It ends in death. It ends in destruction, because you're avoiding your pain. You're avoiding doing the deeper work. You're avoiding healing, and eventually you come to the end of your resources. And so again, it's pain, but on a whole nother level that can kind of reorient one's life. So again, it's sort of, you could say on one level, it's the desire not to suffer. That there is something divine. It's the sort of the divine aspect of the pleasure-seeking principle. So we're talking about here is true peace, is true healing, is true relief. But it unfortunately comes through going through hell. Is that always the case? I don't know. Um, so, but with sexuality, we're talking about a very powerful. Well, let me just try to tie this up, or go a little further here. And so that movement back, come to the end of your seeking, and in a sense, you could say the spiritual pursuit is the only identification that's going to heal you is total annihilation of identity. Another way to say that is oneness with God, oneness with creation. That there's no surrogate identity, there's nowhere to rest. And the movement, so we go out as far as we can in pursuit. This is sort of, I guess, the prodigal son kind of encodes this journey, that we go out in pursuit of glory, externally, gratification, egoic, the triumph of the egoic will, or the ego over creation, to become the biggest, the best, to acquire, to have the best, most satisfying experiences, whatever. Externally, that's the prodigal son taking his wealth out into the world, but it ends up with him face down, eating out of the pig's trough, covered in mud or whatever. And so the journey back is the journey to innocence. It's the return to innocence. Who's that, Enya? But it really is, it's the return to innocence. And part of me wants to say it's innocence at a higher octave, and to kind of echo things that I've heard other people talk about, because it's sort of like we had this, in a traditional context, in traditional society, it preserves a kind of innocence because we don't get lost in all these debauched ways of moving through life. We don't degrade and debase ourselves through addiction because there's all these kind of moral and just embedded prohibitions in a traditional society that they don't even have to contend. Not that it's true paradise, but in many ways it keeps the chaos at bay, and it kind of gives a kind of social and cultural, religious framework to prevent the excesses of the species. So much of what I'm talking about just wouldn't even be relevant. And so there's a kind of innocence there. And you see it, and there's something so sweet and beautiful about it, especially, I guess my closest access to something like that would be, let's just say Mormonism. I grew up around Mormons, and I know this is simplistic, but and then there's many exceptions to this, but it's a very traditional group, uh, community, and there is a kind of sweetness and wholesomeness and just sort of natural integrity, coherence, that I can easily connect with and recognize in the families that I knew growing up. And it's precious. There's something really beautiful about that. You could say in the Amish, or, just whatever kind of traditional context. So there's that kind of, original wholeness. And then there's this chaotic deconstruction phase where all of that breaks down. Everything is problematized, everything is disassembled, broken apart, undermined, dissolved, deconstructed. Which is sort of just culturally where we are, where we've been for decades now. And it's perilous, like I said. And you hope, you hope that in the kind of framework theory that I'm trying to sketch out here, that original innocence, the kind of deconstruction of social cohesion, and you could call it liberation from oppressive dynamics in certain ways, because of course the traditional casts its own shadows in certain ways, and puritanism, puritanicality, whatever, being overly righteous, and repression, of course, is a big concern, danger, reality. And so the deconstruction phase is sort of, it's just so fraught. It's such a fraught terrain. But let's just say best case scenario, or ideally, you go through a deconstruction phase, and that leads to a higher reconstruction, a higher integration, a higher reorientation of values, which would be the return to innocence. So it's like paradise in the traditional sense, paradise lost, deconstruction phase, I guess postmodernism, and just, yeah, that's a bigger discussion, but deconstruction phase would be like paradise lost, and then reconstruction, paradise regained. And it's an so innocence restored, but it's at a higher octave. It's having I don't know, because I'm even starting to lose faith in that model. Even though I can see the truth in some sense, because it's like you reaffirm the traditional, you reaffirm the goodness of order and of, coherence socially, and you see the kind of wisdom in the traditional, once you get past that deconstructive phase. So it's almost like a return to those values, but it's at a more conscious level. It's not just an artifact or a result of your conditioning or your upbringing, that you return to a kind of modesty, a kind of settledness, a kind of peace, kind of temperance, balance. It's not just sort of reflexive, culturally ingrained. It comes from a kind of a living wisdom, I guess. So, yeah, I'm sort of still working all this out, and I don't know how much I believe about all that, but it's like it's like in the initial phase, you need the law and you need kind of external structures to kind of keep things running. Second phase, it's like, fuck the law. We're going to break all this apart because it's, we're liberating ourselves from external tyranny. In the kind of reordering phase, reconstruction phase, it's almost like you are the living law. You are the law. You are the living. You're one with creation. You're one with the universal law. Different ways of saying it. Trying to think where I got off track here. Yeah, so sexuality in the context of all this, it's like, for a long time we just had traditional values, kind of protected us from our own excesses. And a lot of it was centered around sexuality and sexual energy, because it's such a primordial, powerful energy. It's the energy of creation, energy of, the species continuing, reproductive energy. There's that reproductive mandate imperative behind the energy, that if you want to look at it in terms of evolutionary biology, and I don't really want to look at it that way, but it's one story, let's say, that has some explanatory power. You can understand why it's such a powerful energy, right? That it's been honed over countless millennia. I mean, how far back do you want to start the clock? I mean, it's ultimately it's the energy of the Big Bang in some sense. Again, yeah, it's the energy of creation moving through us. And so, of course, it's going to be powerful. But then you combine that energy, that biological imperative, all the years, eons of evolution, honing that, refining that, kind of optimizing that, sexual arms race, or however you want to think about it. In a more naturalistic context, you combine that with our present moment, where the sort of cultural guardrails have been taken off. And so we're kind of adrift, socially, culturally, spiritually. And it's one of the great ways that we can become addicted, get lost, become enslaved to our, sexual passions. And because we don't have a healthy or integrated understanding of it, and because we're so kind of undisciplined and just addicted, um, and there's so many, let's say, routes to oblige our impulses, it's a mess. It's a real fucking mess. And here's where traditional values, and specifically, in the spiritual context, can really teach us something and really offer kind of a raft or a buoy, or what is it? A life preserver, a life vest, flotation device. I can't think of the right word. Can help us, as we're drowning in this sea of delights, this sea of addiction. And I think here's where something like celibacy, it becomes very interesting just to introduce as an idea, as something to think about, as something to explore, almost as a shock therapy, because we're so adrift. I talked about, with fentanyl and the idea of this fentanylization of every kind of addiction, that are the additives and the addictive ingredients in foods. There's just such a kind of industrial science behind creating the most addictive, food products. And it's not, it's a fairly well understood and they've got it down down pat, that understanding and that ability to make foods that empty calories, shit for your health, but very addictive, that will keep people coming back again to our own peril, to our own detriment. That will buy because they are so momentarily gratifying. And that's sort of the fentanylization, you could say, of food. I think about with content consumption, movies. It's like our attention spans have narrowed and become more and more concentrated over time, such that, it used to be an event where you'd go out to the movies and, take a couple hours, and it was kind of a special, fun thing to do. Get popcorn and get settled in, you get your tickets ahead of time, maybe even camp out hours in advance to get tickets, or, there's something, and I think it still is in some special cases that way, but less and less so now, as content has just kind of followed this fentanylization, where, even kind of, if you want to look at it in the more extreme sense, what was once, there was still this kind of social collective dimension to going out to the movies. It's kind of become more and more isolated, more and more bespoke to our own individual preferences, more and more individualistic, atomized, such that we have these, devices, and even the length, let's say. I've thought about this, I haven't thought about this in a while, but, in older movies, you'd have any particular camera shot, any particular scene, maybe a slow pan, a wide angle, and kind of time to sort of sit with the particular shot and absorb what was going on in the scene. And it was kind of a slower pace between cutting to another scene or changing the camera angle. You can see this in older movies. If you wanted to, what's the word? Put this into some kind of a metric, it would be something like the length of any scene before it cuts to another scene, or the length of any camera shot before it cuts to another camera shot. That length has diminished over time such that you just have like these rapid fire angle changes, and the amount of time or attention spent on any one shot is diminished. I remember thinking about that in relation to children's cartoons and watching them with a more adult set of eyes as I got older, and just seeing how frenetic and kind of chaotic some of these cartoons had gotten, and just how deleterious, let's say, or detrimental it could be to one's attention span. That we're just constantly moving to another shot, to another character, to another angle, to just all this information overload, sensory overload. So there's that dimension, but then also just the length of what we're willing to watch, has become shorter and shorter and shorter as there's more and more content, and more of a war for our attention and captivating our attention. And something like TikTok or Twitter is, again, just kind of the logical conclusion of that almost fentanylization of extracting our attention, where you're down to just, 10 seconds or 15 seconds or, a minimal amount of words. And versus, in the old days, sitting down with a newspaper and having a physical object. And anyways, so it's that process across all domains. And it's commercialization, it's marketing, it's monetization. It's a recognition of our addictability and dopaminergic system and just all these different things. And so I kind of forget where I was headed, but with sexuality, in that case, celibacy, I think, is where I was going. It's sort of like we need this shock treatment, or, celibacy can seem like a pretty extreme, austere, ascetic, swing to the other end. But when you're so balanced, the pendulum is swung so far in one direction, you sometimes need kind of a shock therapy, or you need to contemplate the other extreme to kind of start to find a middle ground. But it's interesting that in so many of our traditional religious spiritual systems, monastic communities, for example, that celibacy is sort of a foundational commitment. Buddhism, Christianity, more Orthodox traditions, Catholic tradition, brahmacharya, I guess, in Hindu tradition. But even, amongst the laity, we're not even talking about the monastic communities, but even just amongst general congregation or laity of any religious system, that there are these sort of traditional values and traditional norms around sexuality and temperance and modesty. But you see implicit in the monastic, in the monk, and in the rules that have just kind of universally popped up in every monastic tradition around celibacy and around sexual restraint. Just implicit in that is a recognition, going back millennia, of how powerful this energy is. the libido, sexual energy, lust, sex drive, and that the spiritual pursuit is greatly helped at a minimum by having discipline in this area and learning to and see the shadow side here is repression, and that's not where we're headed either. That's a dead end as well. And that can be part of what's wise about the deconstruction phase, is allowing some of that repression and the shadow to come up, to be healed and transmuted. But there's a lot of wisdom in monastic traditions and in more ascetic practices and self-discipline just generally that can be very helpful and stabilizing in the modern moment. And you hear people talk about it like semen retention, no-fap, as sort of maybe a modern modern approach to the chaos that we're in right now. A recognition, with sex in particular, not only is it very primal, but it's also a very sacred energy. And what's beautiful about traditional forms of community is that it's kind of implicit in that is a protection of the sacred dimension of sexuality, that you have it within the safety or the boundaries of marriage, of commitment, that it's tied to procreation. And that's beautiful because it doesn't pervert it. Sexual energy can become perverse so quickly and profane so quickly. And so it's beautiful, in that traditional sense, to have that sacred dimension preserved and intact in a way that we're just so distorted and lost in the current moment. And when you lose that, downstream from that, when you lose that sacredness of intimacy, that sex is connected to, bound up with intimacy, love, these sort of traditional buffers and containers. When you lose that, it's sort of like, in a way, it's like with, fruit, let's say whole fruit, juicy, sweet, organic, ripe fruit, full of sugars. It's basically just carbohydrates, primarily, majority. Just replete with, chock full of sugar. But it's coming in the package of a whole food, with fiber and with, minerals, vitamins, everything else that's contained in that, if it's a mango, everything else that is within that mango. And so it's not detrimental to your health. What we've done is we've just, I guess what would be fructose, is that right? Within the context of whole food. But we've isolated out at an industrial level sugar. We've extracted it from its kind of natural whole foods package. And then we just take that one element, the sweetness, that ingredient, that sugar, I guess glucose, I don't know all the right names, but we've taken just, pure sugar, and then we inject that into other foods, shorn of, separate from its natural container, and, that's maybe not the perfect analogy, and I'm probably not saying it perfectly right, but there's something similar, with when you look at sex, it's like we've taken out that one ingredient that was embedded within a larger context, a sacred context of communion, of trust, of safety, of, just all these healthy, wholesome things. And we've commercialized it, we've commodified it, we've separated it from its sacred, that sacred dimension, that more connected, intimate dimension. And we've reduced it down just to that, it's kind of most basic what ingredient, or that just, we've reduced it down just to gratification, momentary gratification, the sexual act, orgasm. And at industrial scale, that's what's so frightening about it. Ideally, originally, sex within this sacred container of Holy Communion, sanctified, had this traditional container. Then a step away from that, you started to get, in years past, the more lurid, a more lurid, what's the word, deracinated form of sexuality. It's not quite the right word, but reductive form of sexuality, still not anywhere near where we're at today, but you can kind of see it all as connected. Once you take that into, let's say, sexuality in a profane container, which would be porn, which would be prostitution, things like that. But, even in generations past, I guess just because technology had not caught up to our desires, it was still quite an endeavor to get access to pornographic material or sexual gratification outside of the context of a healthy container. Meaning you'd have to go to a store, you'd have to, an adult store, a sex shop, or, a particular sectioned off aisle or sectioned off part of a store, in a bookstore or whatever, to find a magazine or to find a video, or, there, even just in recent decades, it took more of a intention and effort to access material like that. And so there were just kind of materially, technologically, practically, there were still a lot of barriers, even as the kind of traditional norms have broken apart. And I mean, sexual profanity, in the sense that I'm talking about, has been around forever. And again, it's hard to talk about this without sounding super moralistic. And I've even come to the point where I don't really begrudge being moralistic around this, because I see what it encodes, and I see that it conduces to, in many ways, it can be really helpful, having a backdrop of morality around these issues. But it's not even exactly that I'm trying to get to. It's more just a recognition of the suffering that the profaning and commodification of sex and addiction, being the kind of larger, that it doesn't lead to life, that it doesn't lead to wholeness, healing. It's the opposite direction. And so just at every level, if you want to look at it morally, but also just practically, the impact on your life and on other people's lives, the suffering that it causes, I think that's the more powerful lens to view it through. And it happens to line up with morality, but you get there from a different approach. Anyways, but you see that with sexuality nowadays, this fentanylization process where, it's like we've just gotten more and more efficient at accessing this material, accessing this addictive pathway, and optimizing the potency of it. So what used to cost, there was maybe a social cost in going to a adult bookstore, adult video store. There was that kind of social cost to it, the awkwardness, maybe guilt or whatever, but also monetary, financial. You had to pay for materials, and there was a limited amount of it, and perhaps some guardrails on how extreme it was. Now it's just, we've ratcheted up, we've optimized the addictive quality, the enslaving quality of these, this substance, this addictive pathway, such that, we have endless free access via the internet. And with any addiction that seeks greater and greater potency, meaning more and more extreme content in this sense, the internet is happy to oblige that trajectory, that path, that tendency. That you can, you start out maybe perhaps with more mild content, pornographic content, and you progress, however quickly. Again, this day and age, that path, that progression to the extremes, I think, has been optimized, and so people are probably, you can move there a lot quicker, getting into more and more extreme content, and just becoming more and more divided, more and more defiled, more and more diffuse, more and more debased. More and more lost. It's just so anyways, that's sort of what we're up against. But we're not made for slavery. We're children of God. We're children of the Most High. We're made for freedom, true freedom, and nothing's going to satisfy long term short of that. And so, so again, it's like in the context of all this, you start to talk about and think about, again, kind of the more modern YouTube version of this, or I don't want to just confine it to YouTube, but sort of modern movement in this direction, perhaps something like semen retention or nofap, just restraining, bringing refraining from explicit images, refraining from, again, here it's a spectrum of how committed are you, and that's why I kind of put in celibacy as sort of to bracket the conversation. But, there's parallels of like, if you're an alcoholic, just going, getting sober, not drinking anymore. And I've definitely I've run this experiment myself. And that's why I feel somewhat qualified to talk about it. I don't know about qualified, but I have something to say about it. and I so and I yeah, perhaps because I struggled so much with this and I just saw so much blowback from not having a disciplined orientation or a higher orientation towards my own lust, my own sex drive. Maybe that's why this became uh, relevant for me. I don't know, but I also seem to have a pretty high threshold for self-discipline and pushing myself to extremes. Something I don't know if enjoy is the right term, but I see how useful it is and how it's one of these things you could say within my control that I can do that can powerfully change my life when so many things in life are out of your control and you don't have any real input on or impact influence over. This is something you can change. You do have the capacity to radically change uh, across any addictive pattern. Of course, you have that capacity. You're made for freedom. You are made to be one with God. You're a child of God. You're a child of the Most High. You're not made to be a slave to your desire, to other people's, machinations, to other people's influence. But yeah, I've got, a decade plus of really moving in this direction, you know. And imperfectly, of course, but pretty doing it's a worthwhile pursuit. Let me say it that way. Because once you make a commitment to something like celibacy or however it shows up for you, to start to oppose your own um, hedonistic tendencies. And essentially, what that looks like is burning in the fire of your own desires, not repressing them. Never works, comes out sideways. You end up just hopping to a different addictive pattern, fixating somewhere else. So it's not repression, and it's not indulgence, which is where we are so culturally is indulgence. It's surrender, meaning, okay, I'm anxious, and my mind is showing me, and my mind and everything inside of me, my physiology, the cravings coming on with full force, almost, you could say compelling, demanding. Can't think of quite the right word. That I indulge. And staying, so having that tsunami of just overwhelming anxiety, overwhelming pain, overwhelming craving, and sitting in the fire. That's the path. That is the path. My friends, that is the path. And it's so simple. It's as simple as can be because it's not a technique, it's not a method. There's nothing to learn. It's being willing to burn. Now, how accessible is that for people? Again, you have this capacity. You have this ability to do this. You do. You really do. And it's going to mean tears. It's going to mean crying. It's going to mean your body shaking. Because especially if this addictive pattern has taken hold and it's entrenched, there's a lot of momentum there. And so it's going to take a while to burn off. But every bit of restraint, every bit of surrender is a drop in the bucket, is a movement in the right direction, is a moment of freedom. So you start to shift the momentum and you start to get a more virtuous momentum. And you start to notice the benefits of being less divided, less controllable by external forces and ultimately by your own inner desires. There's great benefits to that. That's true freedom. Now there's the freedom to indulge, the freedom to do, which seems to be the kind of freedom we most value now in popular culture, mainstream society. And then there's the freedom to indulge desire, and then there's the freedom from desire. Much more powerful, much more powerful, much more powerful. The freedom from desire, that's liberation. Freedom from desire, true liberation, meaning the capacity to burn, to let this stuff burn out from you. Let the energy move. Because in a weird way, indulgence and repression are the same thing, even though they seem to be, and I just kind of laid it out as sort of polarities. In a weird way, they are the same thing, in the sense that by indulging, you continue to hold in place all the repressed material. Because once the repressed material is like a beach ball being held under the surface of the ocean, and it always wants to come up. In order to keep it down in the shadows, you have to stay distracted. Addiction relies on distraction. Addiction is distraction. Addiction relies on momentum. So the moment you stop moving, that beach ball starts to come up. That anxiety starts to surface. The shadow material starts to surface. And that's your opportunity to burn. That's your opportunity for healing. But yeah, just that the indulging is the repressing in a strange way. At a certain yeah, because the indulgence allows you to turn away from your pain, which just builds more and more disconnection from it and locks it in, you could say, more and more. Fucked up. I wish it wasn't that way. Yeah, it's fucked up that that's how it is, but that is the truth. Now, of course, sexuality in and of itself is not bad. Of course not. But you have to be honest with yourself, and this goes with, pleasuring oneself, just, or, having, a partner that you're sexually active with, you know. You have to be honest with yourself and with the role that it's playing. Am I doing this to avoid pain? It's kind of one of the fundamental questions you'd need to ask. Is, ideally between you and somebody else, ideally in the context of marriage. Let's just put it that way. But, what is marriage? It's a sacred union. It's a recognition of commitment, a recognition of trust, a recognition of safety, of true intimacy. Ideally, it's sort of a flower or something, kind of a natural outpouring or expression of health, of being in a healthy place, not in a needy place, not in a inwardly divided place. That it's an expression of an intimacy that's already experienced. So if you're using sexual gratification to connect, to establish intimacy, that's not going to end well. Let's just put it that way. That's cart before the horse, or that's ass backwards. No, the intimacy comes from God ultimately, from being healed, from being whole, from not needing something else externally to bring you to that place. Otherwise, that becomes an addiction. But if you're coming from that healed ground, from that whole place, and then it's a kind of expression of that wholeness, of that intimacy with God, with self, with reality. And then it's kind of kept naturally in check, and it's not given too much prominence. It's not given too much priority. It's not given too much significance. It matters and it's important, but it flows from a deeper connection with God, with Source. And so there's a beauty in an integrity and a natural intimacy that can flow. That's where it makes sense. So that it's not an addictive thing, but that takes a lot of self-honesty to recognize that you're probably not in that place for most of us. That it's not coming from something pathological or something neurotic or some unfulfilled need. And it's a real interesting gauntlet to kind of throw down on your life, to go cold turkey, or to start to have some discipline around these things, or to say, rather than using this to dissipate my energy, using this to find momentary relief, I'm going to let the anxiety just engulf me, and I'm going to cry, and I'm going to shake, and I'm going to feel it, and I'm going to transmute this energy. It's really interesting when you take that, and again, there's cautions here, because going cold turkey without having a commitment to healing is going to, you're just going to become destabilized, and that's going to lead to chaos and pain and damage. And so you have to do this in a conscious and safe way, ideally with a commitment to healing. But it's a very interesting experiment to run, because when you go, let's say, celibate or no FAP or practicing semen retention, having sexual continence or sexual discipline, it's going to bring up powerful stuff from the unconscious, from the subconscious, especially if you've never tried to rein this energy in before. But as you move through it and you burn in the fire and you come out the other end of any kind of intense craving, there's a kind of integrity, wholeness. Again, your mind starts to purify, you start to become more innocent. You start to gain a kind of sensitivity and an intimacy, a sensuality that comes back online, of appreciation of smaller and smaller things. You need less and less extreme contacts, less and less extreme substances, less and less extreme experiences to find a high, because you become more balanced. You start to see a natural radiance in things. And that can all be motivation and an indication that you're moving in the right direction. Now, again, you experiment with it and you be gentle and you be wise about it, because you don't want to, again, repression is the shadow here, and that's going to wreak havoc in your life as well. So you got to be gentle with yourself, but also firm. Something else I was going to get to. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, maybe this is not really necessary, but I first heard this term, I think, in the context of Freud, psychoanalysis, and his ideas, this term sublimation. And I didn't really investigate, I didn't understand for a long time. For some reason in my mind, when I heard that term, and he uses it in the context of sexual energy, of libido, I think. Maybe it's broader than that, but for some reason I had it understood in my mind as repression. It was a synonym for suppression or repression. And actually, I looked into this recently after I was talking about it. And I don't think what I'm about to say totally aligns with how Freud saw it. Maybe Jung had an idea that was closer to what I'm about to say, but it's interesting that word. So here's the idea: is you've got this just primal energy, sexual energy, and by not indulging it, by not indulging that energy, by having self-discipline with it, whatever the practice is, if it's celibacy, that energy sort of recycles and refines and purifies, and that term sublimation, the root of that is sublime, something that's elevated, ecstatic, transcendent. And so I think that's an interesting term. It keeps coming to my mind, sublimation. And there is something that happens as you don't indulge that energy in an addictive way, that it sort of recycles almost, it refines, and it purifies, it transmutes, it transforms, it elevates, it sublimes, it sublimates. I don't know if that's exactly how Freud was using it, but it resonates definitely with the experience, that there's a kind of sublimation-like process that sex kind of, that sexual movement can kind of purify and transform into true intimacy, into true connection. Anyways, just things to think about and experiment with, and part of me is kind of curious about the difference between male sexuality and female sexuality in this domain. I think this is probably much more relevant for men. Though I think there's a lot of that's probably universal, maybe just more extreme for men. I don't know. Anyways, take care.